When we start conversations about diversity, inclusion, equity, I find that it's really helpful to actually define what we're talking about, just so we have shared meaning among ourselves, so that we're clear that when we're having these conversations, we're talking about the same thing. I want to start with the definition of diversity. We think of diversity often as representation. Count the people. And what we used to think is that if we had diverse representation, faces around the table representing different groups, we would actually have different outcomes. We now know that's not true. You and I might have the exact same experience, and you might experience that as deep and enjoyable and exciting, and I might experience that experience as anxiety-producing and frightful. So we cannot just think about diversity as counting the people that will get us to different outcomes. It's important to have that representation. But if all we have is quote unquote diverse representation, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a space that is welcoming and inclusive. So we can think about inclusion as not only do we have different faces around the table or in the pews or in our leadership councils in the churches, but do we actually have a congregational culture where people feel like they count? So diversity, you can think of as count the people. Inclusion, you can think of as the people count. Another thing I wanted to say about the word diversity is that we often use it as code. We say things like diverse people. And I just want to challenge us to really think about when we say diverse people, what do we really mean? Particularly for those of us who are white, sometimes we're saying diverse people because we're not comfortable saying people of color. And we're using it as code for race. And there's a funny way in which using the word diversity in that way actually recenters whiteness, because it's diverse from what? So I really want to encourage us as we're doing our congregational work to actually say what we mean. So if we say we want to be more engaging with the African American communities that might be outside the door of our churches, we actually say African American community. In Minnesota, where I live, if we're saying we want to engage with populations who might be African, we actually say we want to engage with the African American community and the Somali community. That we say what we mean. Because if we don't, what we're actually doing sometimes is whitewashing the differences of the communities we're trying to engage with in ways that mean that we're not actually doing authentic engagement. And then equity is sort of the so what, now what? What are the outcomes we're after? Are we after a certain kind of change in our organizational culture as congregations? Are we after a certain kind of change in the world, whether that's about decreasing the educational achievement gaps, or we're trying to impact immigration policy, or we want to change how people in our communities are treated at school as they walk down the streets, police brutality, etc. So equity is, what are the outcomes we're after? And how are we actually going to know we've reached those outcomes? So it is a bit kind of cutesy, but think about diversity as count the people, inclusion as the people count, and equity as the outcomes count. One of the other important concepts as we're thinking about how do we move towards equity is a concept that's important to my work called universal design. So universal design is a concept from the disability rights movement. The concept is that if we design something for those who have least access, those who are most marginalized, we actually design something better for everybody. The example that I think most folks are aware of are the curb cuts in the sidewalk. They're originally designed for people in wheelchairs, but who uses them? Everybody. Bicyclists, strollers, people with high heels, we don't want to lift our feet, right? Everybody uses them. The little button on the door, the one with the little wheelchair on it, is designed for people with limited mobility, but who uses it is everybody. People with their hands full, people who don't want to touch something, right? We do the little elbow thing, the little hip thing, maybe the little foot thing, but it's a way that everybody benefits for something that was originally designed for folks who are most marginalized. So if we take that concept into our congregations, into the equity work we want to do in the world, and think about around any issue, who is most currently marginalized? And how do we design our interventions, our social, our cultural, our political interventions for those folks who are most marginalized? We actually wind up designing something better for everybody. And this is a really important concept, because if we don't think about it this way, sometimes we get into those places around the oppression Olympics, Or we get into the place, we don't have any trans people in our congregation. Why are we designing something for them? But think about that. Let's say we are designing gender neutral bathrooms. If we are going to have trans people in our congregation, who might use those? It might be a parent with an opposite gender child who needs assistance in the bathroom. It might be a disabled person with a care attendant, right? It might be somebody who has been assaulted, who is nervous about going into a bathroom alone, right? So there's numbers of possible people who might benefit from something we assume is only for those who are currently most marginalized or currently most discriminated against in the bathroom. The other word I just want to make sure we have shared meaning about is culture. For many of us, we slip between the definition of culture and ethnicity. And if we don't think we have an ethnicity, we don't think we have culture. But culture actually is just shared patterns that help us make meaning of our environment and help us determine what's appropriate. Really, the best way to understand culture is just the way we do things around here. And so I think this is really important for those of us who are dominant culture, whether that's about our race or our gender or our sexuality or our class background, because if we don't understand culture as just the way we do things around here, we don't think we have culture. And we're really fish and we don't even know it's wet, because our culture is what's around us all the time. And so we're not even thinking about it as culture or who's adapting to our way of being in order to fit in and survive. So understanding culture as just the way we do things around here is a really important way to start thinking about how do we actually think about inclusion and equity. Because what happens is if we're not thinking about culture that way, we invite people in, we do diversity recruitment, and then folks come in and say, yeah, we're here, but this is still a white culture. You might have us around the table, but the way we operate is still not inviting me in. And those of us who might be dominant culture are scratching our heads and saying, what are they talking about? They're here. What do they mean by this is a white culture? Because we're not thinking about our environment as representing a particular culture.